So today let us start with Unit 3 of Physiology portion, that is respiration. So in this respiration unit, you have basically two topics, broadly two topics, pulmonary ventilation and transport of O2 and CO2. So let us start with pulmonary ventilation first. So pulmonary ventilation basically means breathing. So the act of breathing, which is mainly the air moving into the lungs and the air moving out from the lungs. So this act of breathing can be termed as pulmonary ventilation. So of course the major system that is involved in breathing is the respiratory system, and in the respiratory system it includes certain organs of our body, which includes the nose and the nasal cavity, the diaphragm, which is the boundary of the thorax and the chest portion and the abdomen portion. There is a membranous boundary given here. This is known as diaphragm. And of course the lungs, the major organ of respiratory system, and the tube which connects the lungs with the oral and nasal cavity. This is known as trachea. It is also called the windpipe. So it is protected by cartilaginous rings so that it does not collapse. So this trachea is very important for moving in and out of the air. And it also includes the voice box or the larynx, which we know that our voice is coming from that larynx region. And also this trachea, it divides into two branches, which is known as bronchus singular and bronchi plural, and this left bronchus and right bronchus. So each bronchus enters into each lung, each portion of the lung, the left lung and the right lung. And this bronchus, if you notice carefully, they further branch out into finer tubes or finer passages. These are known as bronchioles. And these bronchioles then further open into this sac-like sacs which are filled with air-filled sacs in the lungs, which are known as alveoli, singular alveolus. So these sacs are covered by or surrounded by like blood capillaries, very thin, fine blood vessels, which are known as blood capillaries. So since they are surrounded by blood capillaries, so it becomes very easier for the air, for the O2-CO2 exchange to take place over here, because it can be easily assimilated into the bloodstream from the alveolus of the lungs. Now, so these are the basic parts of the respiratory system. Now this respiration includes two steps mainly. One is the inspiration, that is the air entering into the lungs, and the other one is the expiration, which is the air leaving out from the lungs. So this inspiration and expiration constitutes one respiratory cycle. And also this two muscle groups are very important during this respiration process. One is the diaphragm muscles and the other is the intercostal muscles. Intercostal muscles are basically those muscles which are present between the ribs, the bones of the ribs. So those are known as the intercostal muscles. So basically our rib muscles as well as the diaphragm muscles help in the overall process of inspiration and expiration. So we will move into that now. And also this lungs are protected by a covering which is known as the pleura. Okay. So this is the basic mechanism of air exchange in the alveoli. These are the sacs, the air-filled sacs of the lungs, which are known as alveoli, and as you can see, the capillaries are all surrounding the alveolus. And this capillary, the blue portion means it is deoxygenated blood, and the red is the oxygenated blood. So deoxygenated blood obviously carries carbon dioxide, which is released into the alveolus, and if you see here, the O2 from the alveolus is entering into the blood capillary, and therefore the red color, the color is changing, the blood color changes since it's oxygenated now. It is bright red in color, and therefore it gets carried to other parts of the body. So this exchange basically happens in the alveolus. Now, how the inspiration and expiration is helped by the muscles. So as we already know that during inhalation the air is entering into the lungs. Now this pressure changes in the lungs as well as the in the external environment. This helps the breathing movement basically. So there, what happens during inhalation or inspiration, the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles, these muscles, they contract. So as soon as it contracts, the rib cage, as you can see, it elevates. So if the rib cage elevates, this volume of the lungs, it increases. And as soon as and the diaphragm after contraction, it comes down, it comes a bit lower. So when the volume of the lung increases, obviously the air inside the lungs, the air pressure drops. As we know that pressure and volume has an inverse relation. So with increasing volume, the pressure will drop. So for what happens is that since air pressure is dropping over here and external air pressure increases, so air will just rush into the lungs. And just the reverse case happens when we are expiring the air, like when it is exhalation. During exhalation, these muscles, they start relaxing, and once it starts relaxing, the lungs are contracted. These lungs muscles is small, the lungs become smaller, and therefore the air inside it, air pressure, it rises and the air is expelled out from the body. So inside the lungs, this O2-CO2 exchange takes place in the alveoli, like I already mentioned, and this process is known as external respiration. Okay, since it is occurring outside the cells, therefore it is known as, since it is extracellular, therefore it is known as external respiration. Now, in this case, when the O2 from the inhaled air, so this alveoli contains inhaled air, and this O2 is released into the capillary, and therefore the blood takes away the oxygen, and the CO2 is released here. So this CO2 from the deoxygenated blood now diffuses into the alveoli, and this will be expelled during expiration or exhalation. Now, what happens to the O2? This O2 is then carried away to the different cells, and in this process, the RBCs carry oxygen absorbed from the lungs around the body through the blood vessel system. And this process, when the cells start releasing CO2 and taking up oxygen, then that is known as internal respiration, because it is happening in the cells. So this is the difference between external and internal respiration, and this, when oxygenated blood reaches the narrow capillaries, the RBCs release the O2. So it diffuses into the capillary walls, and therefore the CO2 diffuses from the tissues to the RBCs, and then finally the deoxygenated blood is again carried back to the lungs over here via these capillaries. And here again the same thing, the same transfer of gases will take place, and this process will be repeated in cycles. Okay. So transfer of gases. So basically this we already know that we utilize the O2 and release the CO2 in the external environment, and this cellular respiration, it takes place in the mitochondrial level, right? So during this breathing, this inhalation, exhalation, this exchange of gases takes place, and each and every cell of the body, they take up oxygen and they release the CO2 to the blood, and from the blood it comes away to the alveolus of the lungs, and from the lungs it gets into the external environment. So this is the entire process. So this transfer of gases takes place in the following stages. First, the breathing movement, which I already mentioned, it ensures that there is a continuous supply of oxygen in our lungs. Next is this O2 and CO2 will be transferred across the alveolar membrane, alveolar epithelium, and through the blood capillaries, this O2-CO2 exchange will take place. Third point is that this oxygen will be carried by the blood to different parts of the body. Now the fourth and most important one is that the O2-CO2 diffusion will happen in the tissue, in the cells of each and every tissue, and it will ultimately be carried into the mitochondria of the cells. So these 4 steps are very important in the transfer of O2 and CO2. Like here, the air, with the air pressure, it is mentioned over here that how the PO2 and PCO, that is the partial pressure of oxygen and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, is different in the alveolus, because once the air is inspired, the inhaled air, it will contain more volume of oxygen than carbon dioxide. Now this oxygen-rich air will come in contact with the capillaries. Now this capillaries, they already have CO2 rich blood because it is coming from different tissues and it is coming from the whatever that is expelled out from the cells. Now this CO2 rich blood will be transferring the CO2 into the alveolus, where the CO2 pressure is comparatively lower and the oxygen pressure, since it is high, so the oxygen will rush in the capillaries, and therefore this deoxygenated blood will become oxygenated blood, and this blood will be taken via the pulmonary vein and everything, and it will ultimately reach the heart, from where it is pumped out into different tissues or different cells of the body. Now here in the cells, what happens is that the oxygen pressure, it is quite higher than the the CO2 pressure, and it increases and the oxygen pressure decreases again. So in that way this exchange takes place, and this oxygen pressure, since it is lower in the tissues, and therefore from the capillaries the oxygen rushes inside the tissues, and the CO2, it gets like exchanged back and it comes to the bloodstream again. Now this CO2 will again be carried via this deoxygenated blood through the heart, and from heart it will be pumped towards the lungs by the pulmonary artery, and this alveolar exchange will again take place. So this entire cycle will be continued throughout, and the lungs, they assure us that there will be a continuous supply of oxygen whenever we are doing this breathing movement. Okay. So next is the respiratory pigment. Now this respiratory pigment, like as we already know, this is known as hemoglobin. In our body, in almost all vertebrates, the protein, the pigment that we are using for respiration is mainly hemoglobin. So what is hemoglobin? It is the iron containing metalloprotein, basically, that is present in the red blood cells of our body. Now this hemoglobin is mainly responsible for carrying this oxygen from the in the blood, carrying the oxygen in the blood to the different parts of the body. Now this hemoglobin is basically containing 4 iron porphyrin phosphatic group. This group is known as heme. And this heme, as you can see the structure, it contains a ferrous in the middle, and it contains pyrrole rings, 4 pyrrole rings surrounding it. And since ferrous has 6 coordinate linkages, 4 are bound here, and the 2, one above and one below the heme, will be free to bind with the globin. So this globin is what? This is a protein which contains of 2 equal parts of alpha beta chains. Like it contains 4 polypeptide chains together, 2 alpha, 2 beta. So like you can see, alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, beta 2. Now this alpha beta, they are different in sequences, so they have different amino acid content. And this protein is known as globin protein. It's a globular protein, so it's known as globin protein. And this globin protein combined with heme prosthetic group is known as hemoglobin together. Now, since it contains iron and also it's also known as a metalloprotein, and this hemoglobin is basically responsible for carrying the oxygen. So the color of this hemoglobin, it changes. It is bright red when it is oxygenated, and it is dark maroon red when it is deoxygenated. So by that color we can also understand whether the blood is oxygenated or not. So this color of the blood, that is mainly hemoglobin is mainly responsible for this color. And also each hemoglobin molecule binds with 4 oxygen molecules, and therefore the binding is can be described in this reaction Hb plus 4O2 HbO2 4, or it can be also termed as HbO8. This is a reversible reaction. It is a very dynamic, it is in very dynamic equilibrium basically. Once it can be bound to oxygen, also it can release or dissociate from oxygen very quickly, and there are several factors behind this association and dissociation that we will come up later.